A federal judge in the nation's capital has temporarily blocked the Trump administration from enforcing policies limiting Congress members' access to immigration detention facilities. That includes Camp East Montana at Fort Bliss. Today, the U.S. District Judge ruled that it is likely illegal for ICE to demand a week's notice from members of Congress. Back in July, 12 Democratic Congress members sued to challenge ICE's amended visitor policies after they were denied entry to detention facilities. Their lawsuit accused the Trump administration of obstructing congressional oversight of the centers during its nationwide surge in immigration enforcement operations. Government attorneys argued that the plaintiffs don't have legal standing to bring their claims. They claimed it's speculative for the legislators to be concerned that conditions in ICE facilities change over the course of a week. The judge rejected those arguments. El Paso Congresswoman Veronica Escobar was one of those 12 plaintiffs in that lawsuit. She sent a statement on X saying, quote, "Donald Trump and Kristen Noem tried to prevent us from doing our job. So my colleagues and I sued him. We won," end quote.
A federal judge just blocked a quiet but consequential move by the Trump administration, one that would have made it harder for members of Congress to do one of their most basic jobs: oversight. The administration had put in place a policy requiring lawmakers to give advance notice before visiting immigration and customs enforcement detention facilities. On its face, it was framed as a matter of security and orderly operations. In practice, it would have allowed the executive branch to control when, and under what conditions, elected officials could see what was happening inside federal detention centers. The judge said no, and that no matters far beyond immigration policy. Because this case isn't really about scheduling or logistics, it's about whether the executive branch can place procedural barriers between itself and democratic scrutiny, especially when that scrutiny is inconvenient. Congressional oversight isn't a courtesy, it's a constitutional function. And when an administration tries to limit it, courts have to decide whether that limit is lawful, or whether it crosses a line into shielding government power from accountability. This ruling is one of those moments where a judge didn't just resolve a dispute, they reaffirmed a boundary, not between political parties, but between branches of government. And at a time when democratic guardrails are under constant stress, even a narrow ruling like this carries weight, because it answers a simple but essential question: can the executive branch decide when it will be watched, or does accountability still come first? The policy at the center of this case was deceptively simple. The Trump administration required members of Congress and their staff to provide advance notice, often up to a full week, before visiting ICE detention facilities. Unannounced visits, which had long been a standard oversight tool, would effectively be off the table. Administration officials argued that this was about safety, about making sure facilities were prepared, about avoiding disruptions to operations. But in practice, the rule changed the nature of oversight itself. Advance notice gives agencies time to prepare, to stage manage, to decide what lawmakers will see and what they won't. It turns inspection into something closer to a guided tour. And that matters in detention facilities, where conditions can change quickly and where past investigations have uncovered medical neglect, overcrowding, and mistreatment that only came to light because visits were unannounced. The policy also shifted power in a subtle way. Instead of Congress deciding when to exercise oversight, the executive branch gained leverage over the timing and scope of that oversight. Lawmakers argued that this wasn't just an inconvenience, it was a functional barrier. The administration, for its part, insisted it wasn't blocking access, just regulating it. But that distinction is thinner than it sounds. When the government controls the terms of scrutiny, scrutiny loses its teeth. And when oversight becomes conditional on executive approval, it stops being independent. That's why this policy drew immediate legal challenge. Not because Congress was demanding special treatment, but because it was pushing back against a rule that would have rewritten how oversight works, quietly, procedurally, and without congressional consent. Congressional oversight isn't a courtesy, it's a constitutional function, and when an administration tries to limit it, courts have to decide whether that limit is lawful, or whether it crosses a line into shielding government power from accountability. This ruling is one of those moments where a judge didn't just resolve a dispute, they reaffirmed a boundary, not between political parties, but between branches of government. And at a time when democratic guardrails are under constant stress, even a narrow ruling like this carries weight, because it answers a simple but essential question. Can the executive branch decide when it will be watched, or does accountability still come first? Congressional oversight isn't a loophole or a courtesy extended by the executive branch. It's rooted in law and in the structure of the Constitution itself. Congress writes the laws, it funds the agencies that enforce them, and it has a responsibility to ensure those laws are being carried out lawfully and humanely. That responsibility includes inspecting federal facilities. ICE detention centers are not military bases. They are not classified sites. They are civilian facilities run with public money, holding people under the authority of federal law. Over the years, Congress has explicitly protected lawmakers' right to access these facilities. The law allows members of Congress to enter and inspect them without prior notice, precisely because advance notice can undermine the purpose of oversight. The administration's policy didn't repeal those laws. It didn't go through Congress. It simply imposed a new layer of executive control on top of existing statutory rights. That's the key legal problem. The executive branch cannot unilaterally narrow congressional authority that Congress itself has written into law. If the administration believes the law should change, it has a remedy. Ask Congress to change it. What it cannot do is treat statutory oversight as optional. This is where separation of powers becomes more than a civics lesson. Each branch has its lane. The executive enforces, Congress oversees, courts resolve disputes when those roles collide. In this case, the collision was straightforward. Congress said the law gives us access. The administration said it could condition that access anyway. The judge was left to answer a basic question. Does executive convenience override legislative oversight? The answer legally was no. Congressional oversight isn't a courtesy, it's a constitutional function. And when an administration tries to limit it, courts have to decide whether that limit is lawful or whether it crosses a line into shielding government power from accountability. This ruling is one of those moments where a judge didn't just resolve a dispute, they reaffirmed a boundary, not between political parties, but between branches of government. And at a time when democratic guardrails are under constant stress, even a narrow ruling like this carries weight, because it answers a simple but essential question. Can the executive branch decide when it will be watched? Or does accountability still come first? The federal judge reviewing this policy focused less on political intent and more on legal effect. The question wasn't whether ICE had legitimate security concerns in the abstract. The question was whether those concerns justified restricting a right that Congress had already granted by statute. The court concluded they did not. In issuing the order blocking the policy, the judge found that the advance notice requirement likely violated the law by interfering with Congress's ability to conduct meaningful oversight. The ruling emphasized that Congress had deliberately chosen to allow unannounced visits, and that the executive branch lacked authority to undo that choice on its own. The administration's arguments about safety and logistics weren't ignored. They were weighed, but they weren't enough. Courts routinely recognize that government operations involve risk and complexity. That alone doesn't authorize agencies to rewrite the rules governing who can inspect them. The judge also noted that oversight isn't symbolic, it's functional. Its effectiveness depends on independence. If lawmakers can only visit when the agency is ready, oversight becomes performative rather than substantive. That's why the court stepped in early, issuing a temporary block rather than allowing the policy to remain in effect while litigation dragged on. The harm, the judge reasoned, would be immediate and difficult to undo. Once oversight is delayed or denied, the opportunity to observe real conditions is lost. Importantly, the ruling didn't say ICE can never impose reasonable rules. It said those rules cannot conflict with the law Congress passed. That distinction matters. This wasn't a judge micromanaging an agency. It was a judge enforcing a boundary, reminding the executive branch that it operates within constraints set by the legislature. And in the current political climate, that reminder carries weight precisely because it's narrow, grounded, and unapologetically legal. Congressional oversight isn't a courtesy, it's a constitutional function. And when an administration tries to limit it, courts have to decide whether that limit is lawful or whether it crosses a line into shielding government power from accountability. This ruling is one of those moments where a judge didn't just resolve a dispute, they reaffirmed a boundary, not between political parties, but between branches of government. And at a time when democratic guardrails are under constant stress, even a narrow ruling like this carries weight, because it answers a simple but essential question. Can the executive branch decide when it will be watched? Or does accountability still come first? One of the most important aspects of this case isn't just what the administration tried to do, it's how it justified it. Security is a powerful word. It signals responsibility, prudence, protection. When invoked, it tends to shut down questions rather than invite them. And that's why it's so often used to frame limits on transparency. In this case, the administration argued that advance notice was necessary to ensure safety inside detention facilities. But notice how that framing shifts the conversation. It moves the debate away from oversight and toward fear, away from accountability and toward risk management. The underlying implication is subtle but effective, that oversight itself is dangerous, that lawmakers showing up unannounced pose a threat to order, that scrutiny must be controlled for everyone's good. This isn't unique to immigration. We've seen the same rhetorical move in policing, in national security, and in protest response. Oversight is reframed as disruption. Transparency is reframed as vulnerability. Once that framing takes hold, limiting access starts to sound reasonable, even responsible. But accountability and security are not opposites. In democratic systems, they reinforce each other. Oversight exists precisely because unchecked power creates risk, including risk to human life. By invoking security to limit oversight, the administration wasn't just managing facilities, it was redefining who gets to decide when power is examined. That's why courts have to look past the surface language and ask what a policy actually does. In this case, what it did was reduce independent scrutiny, and no amount of rhetorical softening changes that effect. When security becomes a blanket justification, it stops being a safeguard and starts becoming a shield. The judge saw that distinction clearly, and that clarity is what makes this ruling more than a procedural setback. It's a rejection of a familiar tactic used to place government action beyond view. Point. It's easy to get lost in the mechanics of this case, the statutes, the procedures, the institutional roles. But oversight doesn't exist for its own sake. It exists because real people are affected by how power is exercised. ICE detention facilities hold human beings. Many are asylum seekers. Many have not been convicted of crimes. Many are held for long periods in conditions that are largely hidden from public view. Unannounced visits have historically played a critical role in exposing problems that would otherwise remain buried: inadequate medical care, overcrowding, unsanitary conditions, and mistreatment. When lawmakers show up without warning, they see reality, not preparation. Advance notice changes that dynamic. It gives agencies time to clean up, reassign staff, and manage appearances. It reduces the chance that serious problems will be observed in real time. For the people inside these facilities, that difference isn't abstract. It can mean the difference between neglect being documented or ignored, between harm being addressed or repeated. Oversight is one of the few tools available to ensure that detention doesn't drift into abuse, especially in a system where detainees themselves have limited ability to speak publicly. That's why restrictions on oversight carry such human consequences. They don't just inconvenience lawmakers, they reduce the visibility of people whose rights are already precarious. The judge's ruling recognized that connection. It treated oversight not as a bureaucratic privilege, but as a mechanism for protecting dignity and preventing harm. And that perspective is essential, because without it, procedural changes can quietly strip away safeguards that only exist because someone, somewhere, is watching. The judge saw that distinction clearly, And that clarity is what makes this ruling more than a procedural setback. It's a rejection of a familiar tactic used to place government action beyond view. Point. This case also fits into a broader pattern that's worth naming. Across multiple policy areas, we've seen attempts to insulate executive action from oversight by reframing scrutiny as interference. Courts are portrayed as obstacles, legislators are portrayed as meddlers, transparency is portrayed as risk. The common thread is concentration of power. When the executive branch limits who can observe, question, or challenge its actions, it narrows the space for accountability. And when those limits are normalized, they spread. What begins in immigration enforcement doesn't stay there. The same logic can be applied to environmental regulation, policing, emergency powers, and beyond. This isn't about one administration or one agency. It's about a governing instinct that resists constraint, especially when that constraint comes from co-equal branches of government. Authoritarian systems don't usually announce themselves. They advance incrementally through procedural changes that sound technical and defensible. Oversight becomes conditional. Transparency becomes discretionary. Courts play a crucial role in interrupting that process, not by making sweeping declarations, but by enforcing specific limits in specific cases. That's what happened here. The judge didn't accuse the administration of bad faith. They didn't issue a dramatic condemnation. They simply enforced the law as written. And in doing so, they preserved a space where democratic oversight can still function. That may not feel dramatic, but it's exactly how institutional erosion is slowed, one boundary at a time. The judge saw that distinction clearly, and that clarity is what makes this ruling more than a procedural setback. It's a rejection of a familiar tactic used to place government action beyond view. Point. This ruling doesn't end debates about immigration enforcement, it doesn't resolve every concern about detention conditions, and it doesn't prevent future administrations from testing the limits again. What it does is reaffirm something basic, that no agency gets to decide when it will be watched, that oversight is not a favor granted by the executive branch, but a function protected by law, and that when those protections are challenged, courts still have a role to play in saying so. It's easy to underestimate rulings like this because they don't come with sweeping policy changes, but their impact lies in what they prevent. They prevent normalization of secrecy. They prevent quiet erosion of accountability. They prevent the idea that power can place itself beyond review. In a healthy democracy, friction between branches isn't a flaw. It's a feature. It's how power is balanced, corrected, and constrained. This judge didn't block enforcement. They blocked an attempt to narrow oversight without authorization. And in doing so, they reminded us that democratic systems don't defend themselves automatically. They rely on people, judges, lawmakers, and yes, the public, paying attention to the small moves as well as the big ones. Because when oversight fades quietly, rebuilding it is much harder. And when courts still say no, it's worth noticing. Authoritarian systems don't usually announce themselves. They advance incrementally through procedural changes that sound technical and defensible. Oversight becomes conditional. Transparency becomes discretionary. Courts play a crucial role in interrupting that process, not by making sweeping declarations, but by enforcing specific limits in specific cases. That's what happened here. The judge didn't accuse the administration of bad faith. They didn't issue a dramatic condemnation. They simply enforced the law as written. And in doing so, they preserved a space where democratic oversight can still function. That may not feel dramatic, but it's exactly how institutional erosion is slowed, one boundary at a time. The judge saw that distinction clearly, and that clarity is what makes this ruling more than a procedural setback. It's a rejection of a familiar tactic used to place government action beyond view.
Thanks for spending a few minutes digging into this with me. If you want more grounded, progressive commentary without the outrage bait, subscribe and stick around. Every time you watch, share, and engage, it helps build a community that believes democracy is worth understanding and defending. I'll see you in the next video.